Hey everyone, my name's Maddie and welcome to my reading vlog of the week. The last book I finished was My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This is the story of a girl who is sexually assaulted by her teacher when she's 15, but she thinks of the relationship as consensual and romantic. That is a coping mechanism of hers in order to deal with the trauma of the event. In the present day narrative, she's in her 30s and another girl called Taylor, who is a little bit younger than her, has come out with allegations against this teacher and approaches Vanessa in order to corroborate the story. Doing this would mean that Vanessa would have to reconcile her feelings towards the teacher and re-examine them with the lens of the Me Too movement, and she is definitely not comfortable with that. Throughout the book, you see her grappling with this confusion over the nature of the relationship. She's trying so hard to convince herself that it was what she wanted, when really she was being manipulated from the very beginning. I think as a reader, you're aware of that too. I don't think you ever fall into her delusion. It definitely feels like someone desperately trying to convince you rather than being on Vanessa's side. Although, of course, you are on her side in the fact that she should gain retribution for what happened to her, and that the teacher should be punished. I found this an incredibly difficult read, and as I was reading it, there were so many moments where I thought I was going to put it down and not finish it, but I really wanted to see what would happen to Vanessa in the present day narrative, if she would get the closure she desired, if she would talk to her therapist about what happened and be able to come up with better ways of coping with it, if she could absolve herself of all of the guilt and help the other girls who were equally victims to the teacher's hand. Even though Vanessa is very delusioned, I think her internal monologues are so impressive in the way that she can talk through events, and you always know what she's thinking. I think she even lets herself think that it's non-consensual at some points, and like you get to see the process of her backtracking on that or trying to come up with ways to reframe it. There is very much a past-present thing going on as it flashes back to the early 2000s when she's in school and in this relationship. So you see the key moments when she was 15 and it was first starting, then when she was 18 and in her 20s. Allegations do come out against the teacher at the time that they happen. He makes Vanessa take the fall for it. If anything, I am surprised with the responsibility and lack of culpability of her teachers and her parents, who are not blind to what's going on. Like, there was this absolutely like hearts on the floor moment where Vanessa's mum saw a picture of Vanessa with the teacher after she'd gone along with the fabrication that the teacher had encouraged her to do, and yeah, just the fact that the mum does not say anything or doesn't do more. I can understand why Vanessa has lived with it for so many years, because nobody else has stepped in and told her like that shouldn't have happened to her. That being said, I did like her relationship with her mum, especially when she was older. They do have a moment where they talk about it and her mum gets emotional. There's a poignant moment where Vanessa is working for a child services office and she comes across all of these files about children that have been abused, and she reads this letter that a mother has written to her daughter saying sorry for all of the abuse that her daughter has experienced at the hand of her ex-boyfriends. I think Vanessa kind of needed that from her mum in order to move on. So we've got the boarding school environment where she's first under the influence of the teacher, and then she gets kicked out of that school when the allegations came out, so she moves to a different school where she has these friends that it's kind of like when Bella leaves Edward and becomes an adrenaline junkie. I think Vanessa has been so corrupted by her relationship with the teacher that she doesn't know how to live a normal teenage life, and she's going after these older men in bowling alleys and at bars and in chat rooms because she wants to feel the way she did then. There's been like a wrong mental connection made between the way she feels and who's responsible for making her feel that way, and she's equated that with like feeling content and happy. But then there are so many moments as well that just made me feel so devastatingly sad when she would talk about just leaving her own head when things were happening with older men. Yeah, it was just tragic. It was just tragic upon tragic. And the cycle continues. When she goes to university, she becomes enamored is maybe the wrong word, because it's almost like she is trying to replicate what happened with Mr. Strain with Henry, who is her university professor. It's a complicated relationship. It's not exactly a mirroring, but she's definitely thinking like, I've done it once before, I can do it again, and kind of testing the boundaries now that she's of age and it means something different. I think the author does an excellent job of creating these characters with complexities that just add other layers to Vanessa's story, because if you read it as like a very black and white student-teacher relationship's bad, this is child abuse, then it's kind of like, well, why is the book even there? Because we all know it's wrong. But I think it explores so many different ways that it's wrong, so many ways that Vanessa was failed by the people around her, how much it's damaged her life. with her university professor, he is married to someone who works at the school where Mr. Strain was, and the woman he married was his student at one point. So it's all of these like reflections of what's happening to her, how it's happened to other people, how she's different, how in the end it's not actually that dissimilar. So much of the book is spent talking about Mr. Strain not liking the words rape or groping or sexual assault, like being so abstracted from those words and not thinking it applies to what he's done. Nobody really wants to take responsibility and look at it from an outside perspective. I think there's a nail on the head moment where Vanessa, probably about 75% through the book, is saying that she needs to think of it as a romance when she finally opens up to her therapist, because otherwise it would break her to think that she has lost like 7 years of her life at this point to a relationship that was damaging. There's so much to say about books with this content, and it's brought up a very interesting thing in my head about reading things that make you uncomfortable. I mean, it's meant to be an enjoyable experience reading, but I don't necessarily think that like always reading about sanitized subjects is a good thing. The fact that this has got me thinking so much has made it a great book, that even though the content is horrible, and you know, if I give it a 4-star rating, it's not because I'm at all saying I enjoyed reading about those things, but it's going to stay with me, this book, I guess, in the same way that the relationship haunted Vanessa. In terms of the actual book, I thought the writing was so beautiful. There are moments that are really poetic, especially because Vanessa's very interested in creative writing, and the teachers that get involved with her are English teachers. I think there's a huge emphasis on prose and poetry, a lot of literary allusions to other underage assaults, particularly Lolita. This is definitely like as close to that as I ever want to get, but also Shakespeare and Robert Frost and a couple of other things as well. My Dark Vanessa, the title is actually a quote from a book that plays a big part in it. So every time they said it, I was like, roll credits. But it was very clever. So the writing itself was lovely, and I read an audiobook version of this, and I thought the narrator did a fantastic job. There's definitely a maturity to the voice that I really appreciated. And at the end of the audiobook, there was like this little interview with the narrator and the author. The author also said that it was a book that she'd been working on since she was 15 herself, which is messed up to say the least. And she said that she really struggled with coming up with the present day narrative, but obviously the Me Too movement of the mid 2010s fed into this very well. And there's an interesting exploration on that as well, about people jumping on the bandwagon. I think Vanessa has some very problematic things to think about that, but it's only to shield herself. She doesn't think there's any gravity to the allegations of other girls because they are speaking out against just being non-consensually touched, not in a sexual manner. And what happened to her went to such a deeper extent than that. I understand her frustration, as misplaced as it does feel. And I think by the end of the book, it doesn't necessarily have the resolution that you want it to. I'm very happy that Vanessa has a dog. That's one silver lining to the book, that she gets an emotional support animal, and something happens in the present day that makes you think, okay, she will be able to sleep at night, but in some ways it doesn't feel like enough retribution. What happens to the teacher feels like the easy way out. I didn't think that when I started this one I would end it by saying that I recommended it, just because it disquieted me so much. I understand why it has all of the buzz that it does, and ultimately I would recommend it if you think that you can get through it. So those are my thoughts on My Dark Vanessa, and I will be finishing Exciting Times now, hopefully lighter stuff. I just read Excuse Me While I Ugly Cry by Joya Goffney, and this was my first YA contemporary in quite a while, and I really enjoyed it. It followed one of my favourite patterns in a YA story of ticking things off a list, kind of in the way of Since You've Been Gone by Morgan Matson. This is all about a girl called Quinn whose journal is stolen, and in that journal she's written all of her private thoughts in list form, including airing her dirty laundry about lies she's been telling. This journal is then stolen and used to blackmail her to complete the list by a certain deadline. At the same time, she's doing a class project with a boy named Carter, who she at first finds very attractive, but then has such a contempt for after he gives her such a bratty attitude about her kind of privilege and income in the fact that she's going to a fancy college in New York. The book centres a lot on nuanced conversations about race, about how you can be insensitive without realising it. I loved Quinn's voice as she spoke through how she felt about the way people interacted with her as one of the only black students in her school, and how her friends' actions were affecting her, even though she didn't really feel like she had the power to say anything about it. It's through falling in love with Carter and being best friends with a mixed race girl called Liv, that she's able to fight back against the microaggressions she's been experiencing. And that social theme isn't just a little part of the book, it's like probably the core of it. So I think the title is perhaps a little bit misleading, that you think this is just going to be a very sweet romance or like an enemies to lovers kind of thing, but the romance plays very little part in it. I also really liked how mature these characters were in forgiving each other, because Carter is initially blamed as the person who stole the journal, and I liked how the miscommunication between him and Quinn was not drawn out across the whole book. Like, he was able to admit that he'd made a mistake in reading it and that he shouldn't have done that, even though we did have to have quite the melodramatic moment where he was like, is anything even real? But would it be a YA book without some melodrama? I think in some ways this book was maybe doing a little bit too much. It had a not sure what I want to do in higher education storyline. It had something going on between Quinn's parents, who were having like marriage counselling, and her grandmother was in hospital and suffering with some kind of memory degenerative disease. Quinn hasn't gone to visit her, so she has to reconcile that, and also the fact that her grandma's land is being sold, so she doesn't have access to what she deemed her home. And we've also got a side plot with Liv and another student at the school who potentially have a romance, and there's something going on with Liv's ex-boyfriend and why she didn't choose the guy that's better for her. And don't even get me started on the other love interest that's kind of like a bait and switch or a red herring for the story, Matt, who is Quinn's next door neighbour and kind of long-term crush. Like, that went nowhere. I was not expecting her feelings to completely pivot. So Matt kind of falls off, like he's quite a presence in the beginning of the novel and then disappears, and I think that's all to do with like the lies and the friendship and how they're all tangled in. And just listing it, like, it's a book of lists, but it was doing a lot. The format of following a list can mean that the plot is quite formulaic or predictable, because you know that they're just going to be moving through ticking things off, and you can anticipate obstacles in relation to that. But despite having a bunch of threads that could have been expanded on more, I think this novel still manages to be quite tight. So I really liked this one. The romance between two black characters, the investigations on race and how that affects friendships, and the list format made this a very compelling read. I just finished the Nakano Thrift Shop and I was reading it whilst on sprints with Karis and Rhiannon. I had 100 pages left, so they really motivated me to get to the end. This is a book that Bea read and she didn't have the highest recommendation to give it, but I was still looking forward to reading it, mostly because this cover is so intriguing. Obviously there's something about it that's abnormal. That certainly doesn't speak to the content of the book, but definitely the writing style being slightly offbeat. This is all about a woman called Hiromi who works at a thrift store. It's kind of like slightly upmarket antiques, but also just a jumble sale kind of store, so their clientele is very mixed, and it just kind of charts her working life there, her relationship with her boss and his older sister, and then the romantic relationship that she's developing for her colleague Teiko. In the same kind of vein as Convenience Store Woman, which I read tail end of last year, I think the dynamic between them is very awkward. They don't really know where they stand at any point. Hitomi is definitely more interested in him than he is in her, and it's really hard to get a read on his feelings because he's so withdrawn. And I think maybe just the general content of this could be considered boring, but I've worked in a charity shop. I know the kind of slow pace of a job like that, and just any kind of retail position really. If anything, I was charmed by how they made the basic interesting and how small things that happen, like what buns you buy at the pastry shop on your break, or who you see your colleagues interacting with outside of work, become this massive thing, because that's all your brain has to tick over on whilst doing something so banal. So I liked it. I am definitely going to pick up her next book, which is Strange Weather in Tokyo. And again, this is another like win for translated fiction for me. I have been really enjoying getting into it, as I also read Kim Jiyoung, Born 1982. This was another recommendation of Bea, and she's going to be doing some videos talking about the books that she's read, so I'll leave her to talk about it because she had quite a lot to say about it to me. But I thought it was like a really fantastic feminist read talking about women's place in South Korea, how women are viewed in terms of like motherhood and childbirth and the workplace, the kind of injustices that they experience, and the ending only perpetuating that vicious cycle of women never really being on the same level as men. Yikes. In terms of my non-reading endeavours, I am trying to crochet a jumper for the first time. We've leveled up from blankets, so I currently have a sleeve, very chunky, and I also have the two front panels, and I've got half a sleeve and the back panel left to go. So maybe in my next video I will be wearing this like great but also bad creation. And I also realised that it's incredibly off season. We're about to go into June and I'm making the thickest jumper possible, but still getting into audiobooks definitely gives me an excuse to keep on crafting. Thank you everyone so much for watching this video. Let me know what you're currently reading in the comments, and if you have any recommendations for translated literature, I'd love to see them too.